A little more than a year ago, I made a video on the Junji Ito collection and I was really proud of it. That video was when I ultimately started changing as a creator, and the coming months after it, I was improving in many different ways. Around the time that I did my Darling in the Franxx video, I was thinking about doing a video talking more about Junji Ito's works, but I was stumped on what exactly to talk about. Then it hit me. I wanted to remake my Junji Ito video from the ground up to fix some of the flaws in its writing, but that idea evolved. I wanted to do something more interesting. This video is going to be a more in-depth look at not just the Junji Ito collection's stories, but also Gyo. We'll be comparing the anime adaptations to their manga chapters, and I'll be showing the stories the proper and fair treatment that they deserve. There won't be any overanalyzation to the degree that I have to compare camera angles just to say that a good adaptation is bad. I'm honestly so tired of people recommending that Super Eye Patch Wolf video when he doesn't even talk about the substance of the stories. The criteria that I will use to judge the adaptations will be the following: how well it follows the source material plot-wise, content that was cut or added, and how it ultimately affected the adaptation, and if the work retains the Junji Ito feel. By that, I mean if it feels to provide the same uneasiness or particular feeling that the manga was aiming to make you feel. Based upon these factors, I will organize the various stories into 3 categories: the good, the bad, and the okay. Let's start off with the worst of the anime adaptations, Gyo, Tokyo Fish Attack. If it wasn't an adaptation, this would honestly be pretty good, but when compared to the manga that it's based upon, it feels very bastardized. Out of every adaptation that we'll be talking about, it is the only one that doesn't look like something he would draw. Within this adaptation, the first thing that you notice right away is how they flipped who the protagonist is within the story. In the manga, Tadashi, Kaori's boyfriend, was who the story followed. Because of this perspective shift, it destroyed a lot of what Kaori's original personality was, including her sensitive nose that built a lot of the rocky situations between the two. It's very odd that they did this change to the main characters. Since Tadashi was barely in the adaptation, it had to insert new characters to take over his parts. The majority of his parts were replaced with a reporter that Kaori meets on a flight back to Tokyo. For some of the more minor details, the protagonist shift doesn't matter since you can glean some things through Tadashi's connections, but there were spots that he needed to be instead of Kaori. Through his interactions, you get to know more about the germ that's causing the massive outbreak in a more natural way. However, in the adaptation, you only get to learn about what might be the cause of the epidemic. The manga explains to you that there may be something else to the germ, while it gives Tadashi the ability to normally see the souls of the people tied to the smell that adds to the melancholic dread of the story. Switching Kaori and Tadashi's fates heavily affected the narrative of the series. The characters that were inserted act as a proxy to carry out the important events that Tadashi crossed in the manga. The thing that made these events work well was how they all correlated to the protagonist as a way to ease the reader to the slow realization of the greater threat beyond the fish, while also giving an idea of what was going on. The adaptation uses these proxies to the same effect in order to get across the same information in a shorter amount of time, but because of that, you lose out on the most important part. All of these moments that Tadashi experienced was the stepping stones to one of Ito's reveals to set dread into the character, the realization that Kaori had been infected. Throughout the manga, you notice that Kaori develops symptoms of the infection, but Tadashi never notices until it was too late. Over a couple of chapters, she grows boils and eventually holes herself up in a room in an attempt to avoid the smell with her overly sensitive nose. In the anime, since they were switched, all of that happens to Tadashi instead. However, they don't show you any of these moments. The only thing that you see is what was left at the end of Kaori's character arc, a bloated corpse stuck in a man-made fishwalker. Another thing that you notice is that they completely changed how fast the infection works. In the adaptation, it is way too fast, only happening within several minutes of contraction. The manga makes it feel like it would take several hours for infection symptoms to show after getting infected, but could take up to at least a day to fully show. That's really all that's different between its versions. And with that out of the way, let's move on to the bad. These adaptations aren't in any specific order, but I will start with one of the first adaptations in the collection that stuck out as not that good, Slug Girl. The adaptation of this is interesting. In all honesty, it's a lot closer to an okay adaptation than the rest of the bad list. The chapter for this is very short, sitting at around 15 pages, and they ended up cutting out a chunk of its content. The adaptation and the chapter both start in the same way, but their pacing feels very different between the versions, especially when it comes to the condition of the Slug Girl. One of the things that the adaptation ignores is that the Slug Girl tries to get rid of her tongue in various different ways until she got way too weak to fight back against it, and even explains why the parents wouldn't even attempt to take her to the hospital to try to remove it from her person. Some of the choices in this adaptation could be overlooked because they're not too important, but that final bit would have been very helpful to include, considering it reassures the viewer that the parents tried everything in their power to save her. Had this particular story just have been 1 or 2 minutes longer, it could have really been a great adaptation. It's the only story within the Junji Ito collection that I think was heavily affected by how much time was left in the episode. On the other hand, The Town of No Roads is the adaptation that I feel is the worst within the Junji Ito collection anime. It cuts out a large portion of the setup for the story and leaves it feeling fairly hollow, completely taking away the Junji Ito feel about it. The story is supposed to explore fears based around privacy in many forms, but the scenes that were cut out and rounded down were something that needed to be included. Psycho, our protagonist of the story, had been encountering all kinds of boundary and privacy issues that came from a sort of chain reaction. It started with a classmate sneaking into her room to make her unconsciously fall in love with him by whispering into her ears while she slept. Her family hears the classmate in her room every night, and it caused them to start spying on her, which eventually leads to her leaving to go stay with her aunt. This is the very basic chain of events for the story that was supposed to be conveyed in its adaptation, but because of the cut content, you couldn't really tell what was going on. The adaptation implies some things for the story that was told in the manga, but since the story heavily relied on its setup, you wouldn't easily pick up on these implications without knowing that context. The last anime adaptation that I thought was bad is The Crossroads Pretty Boy, the first part of The Lovesick Dead. This particular adaptation skipped the start of the manga chapter, which sets up that the story's town has had a history of crossroads fortune-telling, while showing the main character's dad giving a fortune away while they're returning to town. The protagonist of the story has a deep fear for the practice, and the anime left out a lot of how badly this affected him. Toning down this fear makes some of his outcries of guilt towards his girlfriend look poorly done. Everything else about the adaptation was pretty much in line with the manga, but failing to describe the protagonist's fears adequately was very detrimental to this story, since it is what drives him to obsessively counteract the negative crossroads fortunes. The okay adaptations are mostly just adaptations that I had a hard time placing into either good or bad because they were better adapted than the previous category, but they'd have something in it that either threw the story off or made several smaller things worse. Let's start this category off with The Circus Comes to Town. For the most part, this adaptation was pretty decent, but it cut out some of the scenes that give a bit more backstory to the characters involved. What was cut was something that wouldn't make you miss much, but it being there gives a bit more information about this deadly circus than what you would observe from within the adaptation. The cut content added on an extra layer of horror that appeals to people on a more personal level. The adaptation only managed to pass off half of the feeling that the work intends to make you feel. You're also supposed to see the circus from the perspective of the protagonist's little sister, making it feel all the more eerie when she has to go home and tell her parents that their son isn't coming back. Fashion Model's adaptation is another interesting one. It had some changes for the better compared to its manga, but overall it left something to be desired. While it's a lot better than some of the other adaptations, they cut out a lot of extra scenes from its manga chapter, which makes the story seem rushed by comparison. The adaptation starts off exactly the same as the manga, but where it differs is when it comes to the monster of the story, Fuchi. In the manga, it focuses more on how our protagonist was tormented for an undisclosed amount of time after seeing the picture of Fuchi. On the anime side, the torment seems like it only happened overnight and didn't affect him too much afterwards. Her image was constantly in his head in the manga, and it was distorting to become more and more like a monster. These thoughts even bothered him to the degree that he could not write the script for his colleagues because of its toll. While there's not much difference between the versions other than what I've already said, the parts that were cut really hurt some of the actions that the characters take, leaving some scenes feeling awkward by comparison. This adaptation could have used some more work, but it manages to still feel like something Junji Ito did. However, if it were 2 minutes longer, this would have honestly shaped up to be more than an okay adaptation. Tomie Part 2 was a bit harder to categorize than most of the stories here because it was good, but they cut out some crucial scenes to build up Tomie. The adaptation starts off completely different from the manga chapter, but the starting scenes from it get moved to later within the episode. The rearrangement of this particular scene doesn't affect the story, but it throws off the pacing of the episode a little. They also removed a scene that let everyone know that the protagonist had failing kidneys. This particular scene doesn't seem as important, but its context helps us segue into the horror of the chapter while also building up one of Ito's first monsters. There are also smaller changes in the adaptation that negatively affects the most chilling parts of the story, while also lowering the impact of the story's big reveal. Shivers was very close to being a good adaptation, but it ended cutting out a couple of contextual scenes that increased the impact of the horror of the story. And it also weirdly messed with the timeline of events, making things progress a bit faster. Overall, the story manages to retain the Junji Ito feel even though the impact was lessened. However, it's a bit of a mess in certain places in the story, mostly pertaining to the Jade Idol within it. A lot of the horror from the story comes from making people feel uncomfortable and triggering fear from people that experience trypophobia, and that part is executed well, but it really lacks in how the story was carried over because of that small deviation in the timeline of events. It makes some things feel very jarring because tampering with those events really affected how the story ends, leaving you with the same outcome, but also some confusion that wasn't originally there. Painter is the third Tomie story within the collection, and it is very obviously different from its source right from the start. In the manga, it starts off as more of a remembrance of the events that the protagonist goes through after meeting Tomie, who then warps him into following a destructive path. The anime adaptation skips out on him talking to the viewer and jumps right into where he meets Tomie. It's a very minor difference, but getting rid of this monologue completely shifts the tone of the work, which gives it a very different feel by the end compared to the original. If that feel about the story didn't change, this would have easily been a good adaptation because everything else follows the plot of the manga to a T. With that change, it makes the mood go from a somber tone as the painter's life flashes before his eyes to something that's only mildly creepy at best. The last okay adaptation we have is Blood Bubble Bushes. This particular adaptation was very easy to categorize as just okay because it cut out one particular scene that makes the story fairly confusing without. There were also some minor scenes that were cut from the adaptation, but they weren't quite as needed because the adaptation had some decent allusion towards some things those scenes established. The scene that needed to stay in this adaptation, however, was where the protagonist is looking for his girlfriend and sees her with our vampiric host. Cutting this scene really hurts the ending of the story because it makes the protagonist act very hostile towards the antagonist for seemingly no reason. The context that this scene gives makes the viewer see the antagonist in a different light and makes the suspicions of the protagonist justified. In the adaptation, it just comes off as him being very rude for no reason and gives some minor confusion up until the truth of the Blood Bubble Bushes is revealed. Now, onto the good adaptations. I have a little less to say about these particular ones because I feel that they were either perfectly or near perfectly adapted. Honestly, this part of the video will probably be seen as me being wrong in the eyes of the closed-minded. This next one was seemingly hated more than the Junji Ito collection anime itself, but the funny thing is, it was one of the best adaptations in the entire collection. Tomie Part 1 is an adaptation that was done nearly one-to-one, and it was perfectly executed. Upon first watching this, you'd probably think that the adaptation is disjointed and confusing because of removed context from the manga chapter, but you'd be completely wrong if you thought this. The manga chapter itself is just as confusing if you don't notice that there is a flashback midway into the story, which really throws you off. Both versions don't have any sort of way to show that you're looking at a flashback because it's not showing the usual hazy or black border to signify that the events being shown are not current. Outside of that, there's not much left to say. Tomie Part 1 was Junji Ito's first published work, and because of that, it was also his worst one art-wise. It really makes me sad to see people say that Tomie is bad because of its art, when they don't realize that the anime looks so much better than the chapter that it was based on. The Window Next Door was an adaptation that many people tried to say was bad because its art wasn't up to par with the manga, and it utilized a ton of steel frames for the monster. The only difference between the chapter and the adaptation was that the protagonist of the story switched rooms with his parents for a few days to find out nothing happened when they slept in his room. This adaptation always has its content overlooked in favor of its aesthetics, but there's nothing wrong with how this episode looks either. This adaptation managed to carry over a feeling of disgust and panic that the manga chapter does from how the lady in the window talked and how creepily her hands and fingers moved when coming closer to the protagonist. It even managed to end just as abruptly as the chapter did. The Bridges adaptation was also really good, but the only thing it lacked was just on the art side of things. There was nothing between the versions that really stuck out besides the granddaughter looking out to see ghosts on the bridge one extra time. There isn't much else to talk about with this. It's a fairly perfect adaptation. Honored Ancestors was a very good adaptation, but one part of it was a bit odd. The chapter the anime adapts explains that the couple in the story are high school students, but in the adaptation they seem more played off as college students. Because of this, you could legitimately argue that this lessened the impact of the horror presented later in the story, but I believe this ultimately didn't affect anything. Other than the starting bit, that's all that's different between the versions. It's very faithful. Used Record is a pretty great adaptation, but because of how it was slightly changed, you could argue that it wasn't a faithful one. The parts weren't cut in this one. They were instead rearranged to bolster the finale of the story. They did this solely to build up the tension for the final shot in the episode, showing that everyone who died because of that record ended up singing the same exact song. It was such a nice, but eerie touch that was provided to enhance the experience that the story puts you through. The ongoing tale of Oshikiri had a single, very minor difference from its manga. At the start of the chapter, Oshikiri is thinking to himself about his house being an anomaly as a way to set up the viewer to leave them with context for the story. This entire segment was taken out because Oshikiri repeats himself in order to explain it to the classmate who comes home with him later. The adaptation for this was pretty good overall, but they even managed to add something to the anime that made me enjoy watching it over reading it. At the end, you see another pair of Oshikiri feet walking and stopping behind the two students. It was a nice effort in order to entice people to go ahead and read the manga, considering that there are more tales from Oshikiri that haven't been adapted yet. All of the Souichi stories were really well done adaptations with barely any differences between the versions. In Souichi's Convenient Curse, the only difference is that the manga shows Souichi's brother lecturing him about causing trouble for his family, but the anime shows around half of that as it cuts to them already at home and his family chewing him out over it. The differences with Cloth Teacher was the biggest of the three, because the adaptation replaced a character with another character that is introduced later in the story. The replacing of that character doesn't actually affect the story at all, so it really just felt like a pointless change. The other thing that it did was that it took out a scene of the school kids warning Souichi's brother that he's been up to no good again, and the rest of that is shown in the anime, but it was more of his brother stumbling upon him doing it within the adaptation. Rumors has a somewhat minor difference from its manga chapter. The chapter starts off with Souichi reading a fashion magazine that he swiped from his sister. Within the magazine, he stumbles upon the picture of Fuji from the fashion model story. This scene doesn't actually have to exist because it's only there to make it tie into the later half of the story when Souichi's plans go awry. The only thing you miss out on with this is knowing exactly where that image came from. The Souichi stories had a lot of care put into their adaptations, and every one of them carries that feeling that the manga wants you to feel, being either annoyed at Souichi or laughing at him getting paid back. Smashed was pretty great, but it could leave you wanting something more considering the gore in it isn't as detailed as the manga. As far as differences go, there's a couple small changes with its scenes. The starting scene in it is very different from the manga. The two characters that we see at the start of the adaptation are sitting there talking, but their talk segues into the first thing you see in the anime. Before the protagonist brings over his friends, the manga shows you that he can't even enjoy what he eats after getting a small taste of the nectar. The only other notable change was the last three surviving people of the group getting together along the riverbank rather than in a diner. Everything else played out exactly like its manga chapter. Hellish Doll Funeral, while very short, was a perfect adaptation. The only thing that wasn't good was the animation error that showed the cutoff point of the girl changing into a doll. Content-wise, it was exactly like its manga, even down to its art. Greased was one of the greatest anime adaptations of Junji Ito's work. The only difference between the versions of this was that the brother started choking the story's protagonist instead of only busting his gross zits all over her face. Personally, I don't think that this change was big enough to prompt seeing this as an okay anime adaptation over a good one, because it doesn't change the mood of the story. The only mood that it changes is that of the brother, considering he goes from an attempted murderer to just being an abuser. In the manga for the Supernatural Transfer Student story, it starts off with a meeting between the Supernatural Club members and explains a few things about the main characters, going into great lengths to say that Shibayama will be going on TV to show off his psychic ability. This removal doesn't impact anything, as the things that were said were brought up later in the anime. While it would have been a great scene to see, you don't miss anything. Like most of the other good adaptations, everything else is exactly the same as its manga chapter. The change to Scarecrows was a lot more subtle than the other stories within this list, because all it did was give more screen time to Yuki's boyfriend, and it explains that her father just stole the Scarecrow from some farmland that neighbors the cemetery. This extra screen time doesn't really affect the story. It was just kind of a weird addition to the adaptation to make the father seem even more disapproving of the boyfriend than he already was. Marionette Mansion had two changes between its versions. In the manga, the main character was shown to be more adamant about his dislike of his father's puppeteering, and because of that, his attitude was slightly more defiant throughout childhood. It's a minor offset which makes the mood for the childhood bits feel off because, while he wasn't very vocal about it, he made the viewer know that he didn't like the life that his father made his family live. This could have derailed the tone for the story if it weren't for the fact that he thinks more fondly of it after his father grew ill. The other difference has to do with the people in his brother's ceiling. Towards the end of the manga, they showed the people that were controlling his brother's family for a couple of panels, but the anime just shows them hanging from the ceiling after the protagonist breaks his brother's puppet. All in all, it still rounded out to be a pretty good adaptation. Long Dreams is an adaptation I honestly thought was even better than the manga. It adapted really well and it was even more somber than its chapter. The change in it wasn't a very big one, but I feel it was what ultimately made the story a lot better. Throughout the events of the story, a man named Tetsuro is experiencing dreams that get increasingly longer. In the manga, it shows us what these dreams are, and they completely ruin any sort of tension or horror that you'd feel from how they're built up. Most of the dreams that he faces are more unintentionally hilarious than anything you'd really expect. For example, there's a dream where Tetsuro wandered for several years in a world where toilets didn't exist. Removing the ability to actually see his dreams makes the viewer wonder what he's seeing that could be so terrifying. The viewer's curiosity could make their imagination go wild and think of something infinitely worse than what Tetsuro actually dreamt, which adds to that sense of dread presented by its ending. Lastly, we have the best anime adaptation out of all of Junji Ito's works. Gentle Goodbye. With the previous works, they'd have one or two things that are slightly off but didn't affect anything at the least, but this particular story adapted the chapter in its entirety, and it was amazing to see how great it was in animation. Not only does it manage to keep the somber feeling that the manga chapter presents throughout its length, but it even manages to look exactly like how it does in the manga. And that's all for the anime adaptations. This was really fun to put together, and I hope it made you at least understand that not all of Junji Ito's works are badly adapted. There's a lot of people out there that will say that they're bad because they're not one-to-one, or they don't look as good, but that's really delusional to even think. An adaptation doesn't have to be one-to-one to be good, and you can't really expect the art of some stories to live up to their original works because of how much time Junji Ito puts into each individual panel. Also, Uzumaki's anime adaptation is coming. I can't wait to see how its reception will be. If past events have anything to say about it, the Western reception will be like the rest of his anime adaptations. Within the first couple of days, people will say that it's objectively bad, talking about how it looks rather than the actual substance of the story. I guarantee you that when it shows one of the crazier parts from the story in animation, and it looks not as great as the manga version, that's when people will jump on the bandwagon once more. I hope to God that this will actually be wrong when it does come out, because I just love to see people enjoy his anime adaptations for once. They're really good overall. Some of his works definitely weren't adapted for the better, but those are in the minority of his anime adaptations. I really hate that any tubers and other people in the community are spreading their cynicism to affect how people think about these adaptations. I plan on talking about Uzumaki no matter the outcome, and see if it lived up to my expectations as well as how that differs from the public's. Before I go, just remember, the Junji Ito collection isn't disappointing garbage. That's just Super Eyepatch Wolf's video on it.